Hello, welcome to our quarterly Younger Members Committee webinar. My name is Guillermo Diaz-Fanas. I'm a senior technical principal with WSP USA and a co-chair of the Younger Members Committee of the Earthquake Engineering Research Institute. Today, we have the pleasure of having Dr. David Wald with the United States Geological Survey to kick off the year with a great webinar entitled Case Studies of Financial Decision Making Using Near Real-Time Post-Earthquake Information. Just as a reminder, you are in listen mode only. Please make sure that you notice the options that you have in your screen. If you want to submit questions for the staff or a question about the presentation, please make sure to include it and we will address the question as required. A little background about the Younger Members Committee for those that want to learn more about us. We exist to provide opportunities to early career professionals within the EERI organization to advance their careers as earthquake professionals and become more active in the Institute. Typically, our membership is composed by graduate students and younger members, whether they're in academia or in industry. My co-chairs are Ana Hiperuzzi with Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, Maria Colliu with Texas A&M University, and myself. As many of you know, we have different internal initiatives. We try to interact with all the committees that EERI has in place, different programs, initiatives. One of the most notorious ones are the Virtual Earthquake Reconnaissance Team that is part of the LFE program. We try to find ways for younger members to become advocates for earthquake safety and to get more involved with EERI. If you're interested in joining, please email us at ymc@eeri.org or visit us at our website, ymc.eeri.org. So Dr. David Wald is a seismologist with the USGS in Golden. He's involved in research, development, and operations of several real-time earthquake information systems at the USGS National Earthquake Information Center. He developed and manages ShakeMap, Did You Feel It, and is responsible for developing other systems for post-earthquake response and pre-earthquake mitigation, including ShakeCast and Pager. He has been a member of EERI since 1986 and has served in the board of directors from 2014 to 2016, has been awarded with a distinguished lecturer in 2014, and is our current editor for Earthquake Spectra. He is an avid runner, a very great mentor for many of us members of EERI. And without further ado, I would like to introduce you to Dr. David Wald.
All right, I hope everyone can hear me and I hope everyone can see the slides. Raise your hand if you can hear me. I'm kidding, I can't see anyone. This is always an interesting perspective to be talking to a screen, but I'm sure you'll bear with me. This topic has been very interesting to me. I've only come to it of late, so this is new to me, and I'm trying to understand the implications of financial decision making in the kind of science that we do, and I'd like to share that with you today. First, some setup materials. I really want to thank the Young Members Committee at EERI for hosting this. Ashley and Guillermo just spoke, also Zoe, and also folks, Anna and Maggie at EERI. I also want to thank and recognize the colleagues that I've been working on these projects with here in Golden, including those working on the ShakeMap and the Did You Feel It and ShakeCast system. So I've listed those there. We also run a 7x24 operation here at NEIC, the National Earthquake Information Center, and that's going all the time. And these guys are putting out the magnitudes and locations that start up all these other products that we will be touching on today. My own edification in this subject has been by talking to people in the financial industry, and I want to recognize Guillermo Franco, JP, Jason Park at Nephilia, and a number of other folks at RMS, World Bank, IADB, for great conversations about these topics. And I will be sourcing information from Artemis, it's a website I'll show you, as well as a number of different media outlets that I've gotten material from. Just so you have more than names, these are some of the folks here in Golden that I work with, some great people to day-to-day efforts to get things done, and they're just a blast to work with here. And two disclaimers. One is that obviously any mention of trademark, trade firm, product names are really for descriptive purposes only, and don't imply endorsement by the USGS or the US government. And I'm just mentioning those tied specifically to the topic that I'm covering today. And I also should say that this is a rather cursory introduction to the post-earthquake information and financial decision making, and I'm relating the two in what I do, which is study earthquakes. So a little outline of where we're going this morning. Motivation for understanding this topic. I'll give you a little bit of motivation, then background on some of the products that are tied into the real-time earthquake flow and decision-making, background on some financial decisions, and then I'll tie these together with some examples from recent earthquakes and case studies. Okay, so why would I think you would be interested in understanding financial issues related to earthquakes? Well, the phrase "money makes the world go round" is true. There's a lot of very important risk reduction decisions that are based on money, whether it's initial structural design, whether to retrofit, how to approach performance-based earthquake engineering, what insurance rates are required, whether and how much response recovery funds are necessary. These all entail some kind of cost-benefit analysis, and whether to take these actions really depends on financial decisions. There's another interesting component to this, and that is that the financial industry, in making these decisions, really relies a lot on our science, both the earth science and the engineering science, to understand what the risks are and where the appropriate levels of expenditures are going to be. And I should also point out that finances and insurance are really an important component of resilience. Post-earthquake response and rebuilding capacity is vital, and it requires money. So somebody has to think about this ahead of time in order to have funds in the post-earthquake environment. And so just like all the other components of understanding earthquake risk, a holistic understanding of earthquake risk really does require some knowledge of the financial decisions that are being made, just as it does the earth science, the engineering expertise that many of you have, along with the social science and the communication skills that are required to put all these ingredients together. If you want to get a further view of this and kind of back up and look at the kind of 40,000-foot view level, the larger picture, I recommend a recent 2017 publication that is by the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, that has put out some recommendations for financial management of earthquake risk. And I think some of the elements are pretty important to mention. That is that really doing a comprehensive risk assessment includes understanding exposures and identifying vulnerabilities. These are quite obvious, but these are very challenging goals. And supporting the management of financial impact of disasters is required by all segments of the population. And so transferring individual risk and risk of infrastructure and risk to the population is really something that needs to be done at all levels, whether it's individual insurance improvements or done at a national level. And the reason that's important is that financial management really does hit public finances in the case of large natural disasters. And again, pre-planning and having a wider distribution of the transfer of that risk to those who can afford it in the financial sector is probably a good thing. Before I touch on the post-earthquake environment, there are some rather important decisions that are made before earthquakes occur. And one of the things that we put out, and you're probably very familiar with, is the probabilistic seismic hazard map. This is the case for the United States, where a lot of financial decisions on both building code and insurance rates and other decisions are made based on the likelihood of shaking over the course of a 30, 50, or 100-year time period. And so I just want to recognize that there's a lot of the decision-making on financial risk and earthquakes happens ahead of the time. But I'm going to focus on the post-earthquake environment. And some of the key strategies that I'll touch on in the post-earthquake environment are, one, modeled losses. So rapidly determined estimates of the impact, financial and casualties, And these include systems like the USGS pager system that I'll touch on, FEMA's HAZUS, which runs domestically for comprehensive loss models, and then there's commercial loss models and a number of other proprietary systems that are engaged right after an earthquake to look at estimates of losses, and these can drive very costly decisions, including the extent of disaster response and whether or not disaster declarations are made at the state or national level, and what level of financial aid are made. So these models can be used in the short term before the ground truth information and the extent of the costs are realized over time. The other thing that is really key in the post-earthquake environment, of course, is insurance and reinsurance. Reinsurance being the insurance policies that insurers have when they are worried about losing their entire portfolio. They will engage in insurance to a reinsurance company to cover extreme losses. And these are primarily indemnity-based, and that's, as you're familiar with, what happens when you have actual losses. An adjuster or a mechanic, in the case of your car, will come and give an estimate of the losses, and you will be paid to replace those losses. So there's a very important component, and that indemnity-based notion, the fact that it's based on actual losses, is an important one that we'll come back to in a minute. The third component that we'll spend a little time on today is catastrophe bonds or contingency loans. And these, I'll explain in a minute, are triggered by some occurrence of a natural disaster, the occurrence of an earthquake or a hurricane of a particular wind speed or tornado. And these bonds are typically covering losses that municipalities will have, or governments or utilities. And we'll get in a little bit more detail on how these work. Before I go there, one of the reasons we can discuss this today is that there's been an evolution of the products that we've been putting out at the USGS in terms of earthquake information. So we used to have just a magnitude and location 20 years ago, and that star on the map would be the information to go with. We've now moved to, over the years, to DigiField and ShakeMap, which allow us to put out information on the spatial extent of the intensities from place to place. And these systems have evolved to rather complicated but comprehensive systems that provide a lot more information that can be acted upon in the post-earthquake environment. And I like to think of these things, this is an example of a recent earthquake in Indonesia, where a lot of these components are shown on our USGS webpage, and any of these components now has a potential for contributing to post-earthquake decision-making, and I'll show you how that works. So each of these cards represents a different product that shows up now in the post-earthquake environment. Another way to think about it, and I like to put this in perspective in terms of the pre-earthquake information, the earthquake information that comes out at the time of the earthquake, and then post-earthquake information. A number of these tools have been developed very recently, and in fact, if you look at early warning, that's something that's just coming out this year. We also have added very recently ground failure estimates in the post-earthquake environment that allow us to understand the footprint of potential landslides and liquefaction. I'll talk a little bit about this two-pager system in the lower right, which is a combination of the HAZUS and pager loss estimates in the US, and also things like operational earthquake forecasting. These are a number of new tools we could touch on at the end if you have questions about these. But I'm going to focus on this realm here where these are systems that we're responsible for here in Golden, and they feed in directly to financial decision making. I think you might have seen this slide. I've shown this before, where we have the DigiField and ShakeMap system, each contributing the estimates of shaking to other systems, including the ShakeCast and pager system. The DigiField system is intensity-based distribution after an earthquake based on felt reports that come in through the internet after filling out a questionnaire. The ShakeMap, in contrast, is simply derived by the seismic instruments in the ground. In areas where we don't have a lot of instruments, the DigiField system does contribute to the ShakeMap system, so we can have a combination of intensity reports and seismic observations. And the key is that those systems then become available to ShakeCast, which is a user-centric view of losses for utilities and for critical users, and the pager system, which is more of a societal estimate of losses in terms of economic impact and potential fatalities. over the years, we've worked with a number of different groups that have different needs for this information. And so part of the learning process on our part was to talk to many, many groups and see what they're doing with this information and how they're making their own decisions. A number of these are financial decisions, but and these are just examples of some of the logos of groups that we're working with. There are many others, and I just have a representative examples here. But one thing we learned in the last couple of years that was a bit surprising to us is how many financial decision makers are out there that determine decisions based on some of the information that we're putting out. And I've classified these in sort of categories that are overlapping, so they're a little hard to put into categories, but disaster aid, government, risk, reinsurance. And these are rather sizable decisions made after natural disasters to determine, again, the level of resources that need to go into action or the levels of losses that might be expected. So we've had a lot of discussions with these groups, and that's helped understand what's going on in the background. So I'm going to give you an example of one of these model-based estimates of losses. I'm going to hope that this is something you hear. Let's see if this works.
We have breaking news, and it's coming to us out of Anchorage, Alaska, where it is just about 9:30 a.m. local there. There has been an earthquake of a magnitude 7.0. This is a major earthquake.
So I'm going to skip forward,
because that will help protect your home in some of these subsequent aftershocks. Now, one other thing to mention, the USGS has put out that they expect this to be a yellow pager. This is in terms of economic impacts. They expect it to be a yellow, about a 35% chance that you're going to have some significant economic impacts, most of which in this case, Brianna, is likely going to be that damage to buildings, roadways, things like that. We also had word that there's issues for people getting to the international airport there as well.
So I'll skip this slide. So that was just an example of using loss-based models to estimate the losses from a particular earthquake, and it's used publicly. It's used in the media, obviously, and I think she did a pretty good job presenting that. And it turns out for the Anchorage earthquake that just happened back in December, the losses, that was the initial pager alert as a yellow alert, and it went up in a couple hours later to an orange alert and hundreds of millions of dollars of losses based on an update to the shake map, which was due to more seismic instruments, strong motion instruments coming in from Anchorage. But the losses from that model looked pretty good. There were no fatalities, and the estimate of losses in Anchorage proper were in the 80 million range, not including a lot of the private properties and roadways and other things that will contribute to larger losses. So that's one notion of post-earthquake information and decision-making. The other significant earthquakes that we've had domestically, at least in the last couple of years, include the Napa Valley earthquake, magnitude 6, where we had an estimate of billions of dollars of losses, and Mineral, Virginia event, which had estimates of hundreds of millions of dollars of losses. And these proved to be very useful estimates. The actual losses, reported losses, are on the order of 450 million for Napa Valley and a couple hundred million for Virginia. And these are things that were particularly hard to see, but could be modeled in a rough sense, as we've done with the pager system. And the decisions made on these are pretty important. After the Virginia earthquake, the head of FEMA was using this information, and that in part went into some post-earthquake disaster declarations for both those events. To enhance that, we're actually going beyond what we do with pager now for domestic earthquakes, and this is work in progress, but basically we're taking the output of the pager system on the left and marrying it with the output of HAZUS, the Hazards US loss modeling, which is much more detailed than we have domestically for pager. And what we're going to get with this two-pager combination is not only estimates of the total losses, but more of a spatial distribution of losses, including tagging information to buildings, green, yellow, red tagging estimates, and estimates of losses, financial losses on the county level. So we think this will be another way of improving the granularity of the information that comes out for domestic earthquakes. Again, this is work in progress that we're doing collaboratively with FEMA, and we will be putting out these as an update to the pager system. But let's go beyond the model loss estimates that are used very rapidly to some of the other kinds of loss characterizations that we were talking about, both indemnity and trigger-based losses. So I was going to tell you about catastrophe bonds. This is a nice article in the Wall Street Journal. The insurance industry has been turned upside down by cat bonds. What are cat bonds? These are investment bonds that are sold by an entity. In this case, it usually is a local government or transit agency. It's been federal, national governments and utilities and other groups around the world as well. And a modeling company, a risk modeling company, will calculate the odds of a particular disaster occurring, say an earthquake under Tokyo over a 5-year time period. And investors in those bonds are paid pretty good interest rates, but they risk losing the principal they put in if the actual disaster that is agreed upon hits. And the determination of whether the disaster hit is determined by an independent authority. In this case, for earthquakes, it's usually the USGS and our National Earthquake Information Center magnitudes and locations and other information. Right now, there's about this is a couple of years ago, but $72 billion worth of cat bonds and similar investments outstanding. And it has doubled in the last couple of years. So these are very large numbers of investments in this type of bond. And a couple of things I've underlined the different parties involved. So you've got a number of different players that are involved that have to understand these financial decisions. It's governments, transit agencies, utilities. There's always a risk modeling firm to calculate the odds. There's a number of investors from the private sector and financial realm, and then we're involved, of course, as the independent authority. So it takes a number of different players to be involved in these processes. And there's a number of different triggers for these cat bonds. The trigger being the agreed upon occurrence that would make the payouts occur after a disaster. The first two I won't dwell on. The ones that are underlined are the ones that we'll spend a little bit more time on. You can have a cat bond that is triggered by the actual losses, the indemnity-based bonds, but those will take time to develop after the losses are calculated for an earthquake. And then there's industry loss, where a percentage of the total, again, you have to calculate the total losses from the industry, and then each insurance company that has a fraction of that, the total losses will be paying that fraction. What I'm more interested in is the parametric type indexes, and this is typically epicenter magnitude in a 3D region. So you can imagine having a box around Tokyo that's 3D and saying if a magnitude 7 earthquake occurs in this box in the next 5 years, the payout will occur. And it's as simple as that. It's a cat in a box. Here's a little picture to make you remember the cat in a box. But that's the simplest of parametric triggers, and it's used quite widely. A more advanced parametric trigger would be a parametric index, where you would calculate the total population exposed at a shaking level. Say the population in a country at intensity 6 or 7 and higher. That would be an index that could be calculated and triggers the payout of a particular bond. And then more recently, second generation parametric triggers have been advanced and are becoming quite popular. We'll talk about that a little bit more. And these are where you'd have the actual ground motion measurements or shake map observations at specific locations and seeing if those exceed certain levels that are predefined and pre-agreed upon by the parties in this particular cat bond. And one can also have model losses where the actual payout is based on, say, the pager results or the hazards results or a commercial modeling realm estimates of the losses, and that's done as well. Now, think outside the box here. There's a number of different perils that this is applied to. I'm in the earthquake realm, so that's what we're discussing, but you can imagine for farming, whether it's drought or flood, you could have a bond that would be triggered based on the rainfall or the lack of rainfall. There's hurricane bonds where NOAA's wind speed or barometric pressure is used to trigger the bond. And you can imagine all sorts of other realms, and there are many bonds in these different realms, whether you have wind farms, ski with lack of snow, or imagine too much snow, pandemic, IT breaches, and things like that. But back to earthquake strategies. Now, a little bit more detail here. Models loss estimates are extremely useful because they can be rapidly determined. We can do this end-to-end automatically and have loss models that produce estimates around the world within 20 minutes of any earthquake. That's great, but the uncertainty is high. There's a lot of uncertainties in the calculation of the hazard, the shake map, the magnitude and location, as well as the losses. As you'd imagine, lack of detailed inventories and lack of very good fragility curves for all the structures that are involved. And so the uncertainty is very high, and the models tend to be complicated at the least, and sometimes in the proprietary realm they're opaque and not accessible. So there's some limitations to the model loss estimates. Indemnity-based losses are really important. What actually happened on the ground is what you deserve to be paid for if you're insured. And so that's good. The payout should be close to the actual losses. What's bad is the process can be extremely lengthy, and you can imagine for the larger earthquakes, you'll have many claims, many inspectors required and adjusters, and this can take months, it can take years, and it can be an extremely lengthy process, although it's well targeted. There's also moral hazards involved, and moral hazards are the goal of individuals to get as much as they can out of their insurance product, and the opposite being true of insurers, where they will tend to want to minimize their losses through in different ways by fighting claims or litigating, and so that can add to the lengthy process in indemnity-based claims. The interesting thing about triggered coverage, catastrophe bonds and contingency loans, is that they could be paid out very rapidly. If you have a very easily understandable trigger like a cat in a box where you have a magnitude and location, within 24 hours of the earthquake, you can have that payout occur, and we've seen this happen before, as we'll discuss. So that's extremely useful to have the financial resources needed to recover and respond to an earthquake immediately after the earthquake. What's potentially bad is that there's a very high, what we call basis risk, and that's the difference between what you pay and what actually happened. So for indemnity-based losses, that's based on what actually happened. If you have a trigger that's based on some model, you may be right, or you may be off by a considerable amount. So that's something to think about, and we'll see. It also requires a reporting authority for the trigger determination. So you always need a third party that decides whether or not that particular trigger has occurred. So the resource that I go to for cat bond information is online. It's artemis.bm, and this page is very useful. The nice thing about cat bonds is they're publicly traded, and so there's information about all these trades. A number of other things that you'd like to know in the financial realm about what insurance coverage is out there and who is paying what for insurance, and all sorts of information in the markets and these types of things are much more opaque. But cat bonds are listed as they're listed online on this site in particular. Every month, there's a listing of all the cat bonds that get sold. And I'm just highlighting a few that have earthquakes in them, Canada and US and Japan. And these are every month going down the line here. These are $300 million bonds that may last for 3 to 5 years, and they're being added to every month. I'm highlighting a few more here. In more recently, this is just April of last year. And again, these are hundreds of millions of dollars of bonds that are being initiated and will last several years, that are publicly traded, and their information about them is on this particular website. So it's very useful to see how this is working. Now, you might ask, why would people invest in these types of cat bonds? And why are they so popular? Well, it's interesting that obviously from the receiving end, one would want to get information, would want to get resources and funding immediately after an earthquake and not wait for the indemnity-based losses. But why do people invest in these? It turns out if you have resources and you're trying to diversify your portfolio, you can do it in a number of different ways. But investing in a cat bond is completely independent of the markets. So the rate of earthquakes and the rate of natural disaster occurrence is completely untied to the financial markets. So diversifying by having bonds or stocks or real estate or other things isn't as diverse as you might think, because all those can be correlated. With cat bonds, these are completely independent, And of course, the return on the investment is pretty good because it's a risky endeavor. But that's one of the reasons, this diversification is why these have become so popular. Now, let's go back to the indemnity-based insurance. This is a November 1st, 2016 article on New Zealand quake loss tail grows again. So this is an earthquake, a series of earthquakes in 2011, 2012 in the Christchurch, Canterbury region of New Zealand. And 5-6 years later, the losses are still being increased. So claims are increasing and the payouts are still happening 5 years later. In fact, here's the next year, this is last year, and we're now up to $22.3 billion. So $3 billion more losses over the last couple of years. And so there's some real challenges to having very large earthquakes and the legal processes and the claims process that follows. And that's one of the limitations of these indemnity-based losses payouts. And just for scale, this slide shows that Aon Re's estimates of total economic losses from natural disasters last year was about $225 billion, of which only about 40% of that was covered through insurance. Interestingly enough, the text on the bottom shows that these numbers are not all that firm. There's different estimates of the total losses and the total insured values. The insured values are fairly well known because they're paid out, and those numbers can be aggregated. But the true loss of natural disasters is always a fuzzy number, and keep that in mind when we do estimates of losses. They're really tricky to nail down because the actual values are also fairly. Okay, let's go to a cat in the box example. So this is a World Bank sponsored cat bond for $150 million for the country of Mexico. And the four boxes represent payouts of 25%, 50, 75%, and 100% payout. So if a magnitude 7.5 earthquake occurs in this red spot, you will have 100% payout. If a magnitude 8.2 earthquake happens in an orange box, then you'll have a payout. And so it's a very simple notion, and we have seen this occur very recently. This same location now, back in 2017, in September, two different earthquakes, one magnitude 8.1, one magnitude 7.1. You're probably familiar with these events. EERI was involved with reconnaissance trips for these earthquakes. And it turns out that one of these was sufficient for triggering the payout of a cat bond, and that was a magnitude 8.1 earthquake that occurred in an area where that payout would be 100%. It turns out the magnitude 7-point earthquake, which happened to cause more damage, occurred in an area where the magnitude would have had to have been larger to pay out any part of that bond. So these things did pay out, and this is an interesting article because this is just the same day of the earthquake, the first earthquake. The article is about saying that this sources suggest that this cat bond could be 100% loss. So immediately after the earthquake, there's an acknowledgement that there's some likely payout. And in fact, just a few days later, 4 days after the earthquake, the Mexico finance minister told Reuters that the payout was likely to happen and it should be 100% payout. And what he noted was that while Mexico has sufficient funds to respond to this disaster, whether or not the cat bond is triggered, a fast payout would be clearly beneficial in mobilizing disaster relief, and it should be clear whether the payout is done within a couple of weeks at most. What's really amazing about this story is that cat bond was actually implemented or completed only a month earlier, in August of 2017. So the investment on Mexico's part to put out this bond paid off within a month, and that was kind of a success story on their part. However, those simple catastrophe triggers can be a bit of a challenge, and I mentioned the basis risk. So it turns out, with these two triggers, one triggered, one didn't. The one that paid out was actually the one with the less actual losses. We don't know the total losses for this earthquake yet, but it's probably in the hundreds of millions of dollars, and it was $150 million cat bond payout. But on the right, the event that affected Mexico City the most was paid out less, It didn't pay out at all, but the losses in terms of fatalities and economic losses were probably much more significant. So there's a trade-off here between the simplicity of the parameterization and the basis risk. So it's easy to understand a cat in a box. It's easy to sell that product because it's easy to communicate that, but it can be divorced from the actual losses. And so people are moving beyond these cat in a box and simple parameters to more complicated parameters. And one of the ways to do that would be to use, say, the pager system. The population exposed to a particular intensity level would be a good index for a cat bond payout. And that was recognized a couple of years ago by the Inter-American Development Bank, the IDB. So they actually, and this is courtesy of Juan Martinez at the IDB, he provided these slides that show that their strategy was to have a bond that pays out in the blue here when there's 5% of the population shakes at intensity 7 or level or larger in a particular country. And so there's 6 countries in Latin America that have coverage up to $300 million that will be triggered if 5% of the population, according to the pager results, is over intensity 7. And don't worry about this slide here, but the scaling works such that if it pays out from 0 to 100% based on getting to 2% of the population exceeding that shaking level, all the way up to 5%, and it pays out 100%. So this too is not just an academic exercise. Ecuador was one of the countries that is covered for this, and in April 16, 2016, there was a magnitude 7.8 earthquake here, and sure enough, just a couple of days later, the IDB supports Ecuador with a $300 million line of credit. So this is not a cat bond payout, but it's a contingency loan. And this is really important because Ecuador would have a very difficult time getting financial resources after this earthquake. The banking system, the financial system was a little bit challenged, and getting a low interest loan in the immediate aftermath of a devastating earthquake would be very difficult. So having this set up was really important, and this is one of the main tools for Ecuador and the International Development Bank, Inter-American Development Bank, providing resources in the post-earthquake environment. Now, taking this a little bit further, we can go not only to the index of parameters, but actual parameters covered spatially. And so just a couple of years ago, Swiss Re started using shake maps, and a number of other groups are using shake maps and the shaking values to determine whether or not to pay out a particular bond. So you know that shake map runs domestically. We also run shake map for the globe here at the NEIC, but there's a number of different systems around the world that are running the same software. So people can be assured that the same formatted products are going to be available with the same parameters that we produce here at the USGS. But these transactions require this independent reporting agency. In the case of wind speed, obviously, would be NOAA. In the case of earthquakes, would be USGS. And the magnitude location from NEIC comes in and for cat in the box, but the shake map system is used in these more advanced systems. So we've had to develop the product information, the versioning and the metadata and the uniformity of the products to accommodate these types of users and make sure that these are available through our database for escrow purposes and other financial decision making. So this is kind of up the ante on the information that we provide in the metadata. We now provide much more complicated and much more comprehensive information in our feeds that are available through JSON feeds and other assets. But these show much more of the information about what was in the map and what the software was and what the versioning is and things like that are needed for these decision making. So now every time there's an earthquake around the globe, Artemis will put up the shake map because they know now that these are being used for financial decision making. And we've seen how these things have now percolated through the industry and have shown up in places around the world. So Turkey is one of the top global insurance markets for catastrophe. TCIP has developed a cat bond that will cover a lot of the insured losses if there's a major earthquake, say in Istanbul. And they're using a parametric trigger that employs peak ground accelerations at that's determined by the regional network, the Candelia Observatory. And the way they do that is if the spectral acceleration of the ground is over 10% G at least 10% of the calculation locations or storm motion stations, then that trigger will be triggered. And these contracts are always very, very detailed and specified. Every detail is in there. As a contingency, if the network is not available after an earthquake, the source of information will be the USGS SAKE map as a failback. So these things are always specified. We know now that the Japanese are doing very similar things. There's a number of different catbonds in Japan that use Japanese strong motion instruments. We don't know exactly how the triggers are working, but the instruments are used for the one on the GC securities bond, and then JMA observations using some kind of index is being used for these other triggers. So this is spread quite a bit around the world. An interesting and very new occurrence of using an advanced second generation parametric trigger is something that just started in California a couple months back, a company called Jumpstart. Kate Stillwell started this company, and it's basically an insurance product that works for individuals that want coverage at a lower level in California. And these are called mini cats. There's a little mini cats here. This just started a couple months back, and these are second generation triggers that are based on the shake map at the location of the owner's home. And the way it works is if the shaking at that location is over 30 centimeters per second, then based on an annual premium of a couple $100, there'll be a payout of $10,000 within 24 hours of the earthquake. So this is a really new concept in terms of FITech, financial technologies that are allowing us to create kind of clever policies. And this is, $10,000 coverage is much lower than the typical deductible for a homeowner's insurance in California. But this is another way of covering some of the basic losses that could happen with relatively low premiums. So this is a really interesting aspect, and we're going to see how, I guess over the next few years, how this works out. But the way it works is that, for instance, for the Northridge earthquake, if you're to look back at that, this is magnitude 6.7 earthquake in 1994. The area in pink here is over 30 centimeters per second according to the shake map. And 30 centimeters per second is somewhere between 7 and 8 in terms of the intensity. But you would see that the area within pink would have payouts of 100% for that particular earthquake. So we're going to have to see how this pans out over time. But this is one of these advanced parametric triggers that's based on the location of the shaking, based on the independent information that comes from the shake map system. I'm going to just quickly mention that the California Earthquake Authority, which provides much of the insurance for California homeowners, has a combination of the uses of these different tools for different aspects of the insurance coverage. They employ shake map to evaluate what the total losses are estimated to be in the first few days of an earthquake, and they need to report to the state governor within 7 days of any earthquake to see if there's sufficient funds to pay out. A number of those decisions are made based on models of and shake maps of previous earthquakes, but the CA also has catbonds that cover the potential for them having very serious losses and having to dip into reinsurance and catbonds for coverage. Very quickly, I think I'll skip over this topic very quickly, but one of the issues with shake maps and looking at losses is that we assume that we're going to capture all the shaking based on the station coverage. But this is not true for predictive shake maps, and it's not true for instruments of the world where we have few stations. So what happens is the estimated losses, if you have lots of instruments, will be kind of a tight estimate amount, hopefully around the actual losses for the particular earthquake. But if you don't have a number of seismic stations, you're going to have a much broader range of estimates if you add the variability that you tend to see above and beyond the median estimates of shaking. And I won't get into details here, but the issue is that if you look at the variations that can happen of a particular earthquake, you're going to get tails of losses that are very high and exceed the ability of the insurers to pay. And this is where the reinsurers are going to be very interested in these losses. So there's a lot of effort that goes into improving these types of shaking estimates that include the variability that happens in the real world due to additional components of randomness and coherent randomness. And again, I won't get into this for time purposes, but we're trying to do this both from a statistical perspective and also from a numerical modeling perspective, where we add these spatial variations and loop over hundreds of different estimates of losses to get a more stable estimate of losses, as well as the range of potential losses that may have tails that are very concerning to the reinsurance groups. So one other thing I wanted to mention is that, we're not taking into account some of the other expensive losses from earthquakes, and that includes ground failure. This has been hard to achieve, but very recently we've been able to add a component to the loss modeling that gives an estimate of the occurrence of landslide and liquefaction. And for earthquakes around the world, sometimes the landslides and liquefaction are the most expensive part of the component. And so there's going to be some considerable effort over the next few years to try to understand how to calculate losses, not just the occurrence of these, but to understand the impact of losses from these types of events. So let's just close and wrap up by noting that humanitarian response is often very underfunded in the aftermath of significant events and significant catastrophes. And what I'm looking at here is ways that can assist in that humanitarian aid by having the people that can afford to take the risk, the financial markets, put in money and make that available to those who might need it in the immediate aftermath of a disaster. So it's a transfer of risk that seems to me to be quite important. And I think a number of different groups, number of different countries around the world are starting to recognize that these can be used for that immediate payout and the financial stability after disasters. So we're seeing this grow quite a bit. And again, outside the box here, these things can be very expensive. Outside of earthquakes, we just had a hailstorm last year that was $1.5 billion. So these types of bonds and these types of financial products are growing rapidly as our exposure grows. And these are not just natural disasters, but also human and IT disasters, including, in this case, a pandemic bond that was at risk this week, actually, due to Ebola spread in the Congo. I'll conclude with this last slide, and I just wanted to say that, I think risk transfer, insurance and cat bonds now is an important component of natural disaster resilience. A lot of these financial decisions are widely made based on real-time earthquake information, parametric triggers, and the other derivative products that we discussed. For cat bonds, there's always this trade-off between the simplicity of the bond, the cat in the box type, with more complicated models that are harder to sell because of the complexity, but would have a lower basis risk because they'd be closer to the actual losses. And our interest in understanding this and sharing this information is that we're able to constantly feedback this information and to take the types of improvements to shake map that are necessary to allow these things to be done, including some of the things we discussed, and metadata and better understanding of the shaking variations, and also using these maps historically to calibrate loss models to better inform what risks should be taken. And the last bullet here is that it's interesting with real-time earthquake information, we don't follow it because it's much harder to track than cat bonds, but obviously there's decisions being made in real time in the equity markets and the stock markets, and we'll see how that pans out with earthquake early warning and whether that facilitates such real-time decisions. But that's, again, a place where understanding what the financial contributions to the whole picture is becomes very important. More information is available in these slides. I point to a few places, and with that, I will thank you and thank the EERI and the Young Members Committee for putting this together.
Thank you, David. This was such a great presentation. So we have another 9 minutes. So I invite the attendees to stay for the next 9 minutes. We have a few questions. In case that you have to log off now, please remember to complete the survey following the seminar. So the first question is, Dave, can you comment on the release date for two-pager?
Yeah. Well, we're able to do that manually. We wait for we hand the shake map over to FEMA, and FEMA hands back the output that we need to make the 2-pager. So for any upcoming disaster, we could put that together, but the distribution might be limited. The product has been reviewed, but it hasn't been formally released by the USGS. One of the ways we do that is to have a peer-reviewed journal article representing that content, and there is one in review right now. And so I think over the next few months we'll have permission to put that online. But there are some web development issues that need to be done as well. So I'd say over the next few months.
Okay, the next question is, does the Shakecast or Pager report consider specifics on building inventory and soil conditions? And does the quality of this data vary across different countries significantly?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Shake map itself does take into account site condition. The quality of that calculation is dependent on the location of the region. In California, we have much better site condition maps than we have for much of the world. So we have a proxy for site conditions. As far as the losses go, on the Shakecast system, the fragilities and the understanding of the building response or structural response or bridge response is up to the user, and typically Department of Transportation will have a pretty good estimate of what their bridge response would be to shaking. With the Pager system, we're looking at a much more generic inventory, and it varies from place to place around the world. And one of the reasons we go with an empirical model, which is based on past earthquakes in each country, rather than trying to understand all the distribution of structures and their responses, is that those data are insufficient in a number of places around the world. But the historical data for what's happened in past earthquakes is informative of what happens in future earthquakes. So I'd say the answer to that is it's highly variable, and it can be improved dramatically over places around the world as we gather and collect more information to do so.
Thank you. The next question is regarding, so you mentioned that operational aftershock forecasting. And the question is if you could please describe briefly how you do this.
Yeah, so this is a new product that the USGS has been kind of evolving. It's been in prototype, and it's been done informally, but now for any significant earthquake domestically around the world, we can compute the statistics, the likelihood of aftershocks at different magnitude levels over different time periods that are likely to happen for, say, a magnitude 7 earthquake in a particular location. And the statistics vary from place to place, depending on the tectonics. And they will also vary as a function of time as that sequence is determined to be more or less active than the statistical average. And so we can provide at least a general sense of the likelihood of aftershocks. For a magnitude 7, you might have one magnitude 6 and 10 magnitude 5s, for instance. And those statistics vary from place to place and time to time after a main shock. And the hope is to turn that into more sophisticated products where we can look at the probability of particularly shaking level and not just the probability of the occurrence of an aftershock.
The next question is, what is required in order to extend Pager for multi-severity casualties?
Great question. So there's 2 different tacks one can take for getting, say, casualties, non-fatal casualties, injury rates for loss estimates. One would be to have an empirical model where you have historically cataloged what has happened in different injury states levels for different earthquakes. It turns out that's extremely difficult because there's much more data about fatalities than there are about injuries, and even the definition of injuries varies from place to place and is typically fairly poorly characterized in devastating earthquakes where it's not the highest priority to collect those data. So empirically, it's very difficult to do anything but fatalities. So one would want to go to a mechanical model where you have the number of structures, the number of occupants in the structures, the vulnerabilities, fragilities of the structures, and to estimate, given a particular collapse or damage state of the structure, what the number of injuries, non-fatal injuries and casualties would be. And again, that is very difficult to do because the data that's required to do a mechanical model is so vast. It's not only about structures, it's about demographics, about people, where they are and how many there are, and the injury rates per type of damage state. So those are all very challenging problems that we're slowly moving forward on, but we'll take some time.
So we're getting many more questions. I don't know if we'll have time for all of them. If your question cannot be answered, we'll forward them to Dr. Wald. I'll try to ask the last two. First one is, for a country with lack of measuring station or lack of data, Dr. Wald mentioned that the estimate value has a larger uncertainty. How does an insurance company or authority handle this uncertainty once a major earthquake or losses occur?
Yeah, well, that's a tough one because those uncertainties are inherent. You can't reduce those without a lot more information than we have. One of the reasons that the cat in the box triggers are popular is that the magnitude and location, it has uncertainty to it, but it's fairly unambiguous, and so one can determine whether or not that occurred very, very precisely. When it comes to loss calculations, it would be difficult to use say a pager loss estimates to make financial decisions other than large-scale ones responding and aid, starting response and aid packages and things like that, especially in countries where you have less information about the shaking and less information about the building inventory. So I think it's really important on the community, the financial community especially, to understand where these models can be considered robust and where they would be have a lot more uncertainty due to the lack of the ability to calibrate based on the lack of historic events or the lack of inventory information.
Great. And I think this next one might be our last question. How does earthquake location uncertainty and applying relocation algorithms affect the financial considerations? For example, location grid on the heat map might change.
Right. So these are really interesting questions. The specificities are spelled out in very great detail in these catbond triggers. Typically, you say the magnitude and location of the USGS MW magnitude and hypocenter 24 hours or 72 hours after the earthquake is the authoritative location. Now, it may be in one box or another, and it is just a slight change would move over the payment, but as long as both parties agree to that particular location at that particular time after the earthquake as being authoritative, that's what settles the score. And so, you know, those boxes tend to be slightly smooth, but you can imagine situations where a substantial amount of funding would depend on exactly which box you're in. So that's why we provide things in high precision, and we're also cognizant of the fact that these things are looked at by a number of different groups, but it doesn't affect the science and underlying the determination of these locations.
Thank you so much, David. So if your question wasn't answered, we're going to try to follow up after the webinar. So for more information on our committee, visit us at ymc.eeri.org. PDHs are available, or CEUs. For more information, we'll be providing it in a follow-up email. Please remember to respond to the post-webinar survey. These slides are going to be available, and this has been recorded and will be available as well on our website. And I hope to see you all in Vancouver once again. Thank you so much, Dr. David Wald, and to the EERI staff for making this possible.
Thanks, Guillermo.